There's a reason we're told to stay away from abandoned places. When a building is left to rot for decades, it doesn't just become empty, it becomes a vacuum for things that do want to belong in the light of day. Tonight, I'm sharing 3 experiences from people who stepped into the decaying halls of abandoned schools, only to realize that some things are never truly dismissed. From a photographer who found a terrifying connection to the past, 2 explorers who caught something impossible on camera. These stories prove that once the final bell rings, you should never go back inside. Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Because these are 3 terrifying abandoned school horror stories. They say you only feel a true chill when something is looking at you that shouldn't even have eyes. I never believed that until I looked back at the footage and realized we weren't the only ones exploring that school. It was late October, and my friend Leo and I were looking for something to do. We live in a town where the most exciting thing is a new car wash. So when the old Northside High was slated for demolition after sitting vacant for 15 years, we knew we had to go in. It was one of those massive, sprawling brick buildings from the 1950s that looked more like a prison than a place of learning. We got there around 11:30 p.m. The perimeter fence had a gap near the gym, and it didn't take us long to slip through. The air inside was heavy thick with the smell of wet drywall, floor wax, and that specific, lingering scent of old paper. Our flashlights cut narrow, aggressive paths through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny insects in the air. "This place gives me the creeps, man," Leo whispered. His voice echoed down the long locker-lined hallway. I laughed, though my heart was already thudding against my ribs. "That's the point, isn't it? Just keep the camera steady." Leo was filming for a small YouTube channel, holding his phone on a stabilizer. We wandered through the chemistry labs where glass beakers were still lined up on the black stone counters, and through the library where the ceiling had partially collapsed, burying the bookshelves under mounds of white insulation. About 40 minutes in, we reached the double doors of the cafeteria. As we pushed them open, the hinges let out a long, rusted groan that seemed to vibrate through my very teeth. We stepped inside, and our beams swept across the vast, open space. The folding tables were all tucked away into the walls, leaving the floor mostly empty, except for the scattered remains of trash and broken tiles. Then, my light hit something in the center of the room. "Whoa," I said, stopping dead. "What is that?" About 30 feet away, sitting perfectly upright on the floor, was a figure. It was pale, headless, and armless as standard Rasusian CPR dummy used for health classes. It was just sitting there, perched on its plastic torso, facing the far wall. "Someone's messing with us," Leo said, his voice cracking slightly. He panned the camera toward it. "Some other kids probably left it there to freak people out." We walked closer, our footsteps clicking sharply on the linoleum. The dummy was pristine to clean for a building that had been rotting for over a decade. It sat in a patch of moonlight filtering through a high, barred window. There was something deeply unsettling about its posture. It didn't look like it had been tossed there. It looked like it was waiting. "Let's get out of here," I said, a sudden, cold wave of dread washing over me. The vibe just changed. Leo agreed. We didn't run, but we walked fast, retreating back through the double doors and making our way toward the exit. We didn't see or hear anything else the rest of the night. We got back to my car, joked about how we were paranoid, and I dropped him off at his house. The real horror didn't start until 2 hours later. My phone buzzed on my nightstand at 2:15 a.m. It was a FaceTime call from Leo. When I answered, his face was pale, almost gray. He was sitting in his dark room, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Dude, you need to see the cafeteria footage," he said. His voice was shaking so hard I could barely understand him. "What? Did we miss a ghost or something?" I tried to joke, but my stomach dropped. "I'm sending you a screen recording," he said. "Watch the dummy. Don't look at us, just watch the dummy." A file popped up in our chat. I opened it. It was the 30 seconds of footage from when we first entered the cafeteria. I saw our flashlight beams dancing across the floor. I saw the dummy sitting there, still and silent. In the video, Leo and I are heard whispering. Then, we start to turn around to leave. As the camera begins to pan away, the stabilizer keeps the frame on the dummy for just a second longer than I remembered. In that split second, The dummy's head, which I could have sworn wasn't even there, slowly rose from the chest cavity. It didn't just appear. It slid up with a smooth, mechanical precision, and then, as we reached the doors, the head snapped. It didn't turn slowly. It jerked 45 degrees to the left, staring directly at our retreating backs. I felt the blood drain from my face. Leo ... It moved. Keep watching, he hissed. I scrolled the timeline forward. As we reached the exit, the camera caught one last glimpse of the cafeteria through the closing door. The dummy wasn't sitting anymore. It was leaning forward on its stumps, its face pressed against the floor, beginning to drag itself toward the doors we had just walked through. It moved with a sickening, rhythmic hitch, like an inchworm made of hard plastic. But that wasn't the worst part. "Look at the very end," Leo whispered. I played the last 3 seconds. As the door to the cafeteria finally clicked shut in the video, a real, human hand with long, dirt-caked fingernails reached out from the darkness behind the dummy and rested on its plastic shoulder. A face began to peel itself out from the shadows behind the figure, eyes reflecting the light of Leo's phone like a cat's. It wasn't a ghost. It was a person. Someone who had been sitting perfectly still behind that dummy, using it like a shield, watching us the entire time. And as the door closed, the person in the video looked directly into the lens and smiled a wide, toothless grin that seemed to stretch too far across their face. I haven't slept since. Every time I close my eyes, I see that plastic head snapping toward us. But what haunts me more is the realization that if we had stayed just 1 minute longer to investigate that dummy, we wouldn't have been the ones holding the camera. We never went back to Northside High. A week later, the building caught fire under mysterious circumstances and burned to the ground. The fire department found remains in the basement, but they weren't human. They found dozens of those CPR dummies, all stripped of their plastic skins, arranged in a circle around a single, makeshift bed. I still have the video on my phone. I can't bring myself to delete it, but I can't watch it anymore either, because every time I do, I swear the person in the background is a little bit closer to the lens than they were the time before. Sometimes, the past doesn't just stay behind us, it waits for us to catch up. I thought I was just taking a souvenir from a dead building, but looking at that photo now, I realize I wasn't finding a piece of history. I was looking at a death warrant. I've always been drawn to ruins. There is a specific kind of silence in an abandoned school that you can't find anywhere else. Heavy, expectant quiet, as if 1,000 voices were suddenly cut off in the middle of a sentence. Last April, I decided to check out the Blackwood Preparatory Academy. It had been closed since the mid-70s, after a structural scandal, and since then, the woods had been slowly swallowing it whole. The morning was cold and damp, the kind of day where the fog clings to your clothes like a wet shroud. I was wearing my favorite hiking jacket, a bright mustard yellow North Face shell with a distinct black repair patch on the left elbow where I'd snagged it on a fence a month prior. It was my lucky jacket, or so I thought. Getting inside was easy. A side door had rusted off its hinges, leaving a gaping black maw in the side of the brick building. As I stepped in, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. My breath hitched in the air, a pale ghost of a sigh. The hallways were littered with the debris of a vanished era. Shattered glass, warped textbooks, and those heavy, wooden desks that always seemed to smell like pencil shavings and old gum. I spent about 2 hours wandering the upper floors, taking photos of the peeling green paint and the ivy creeping through the broken windows. It was on my way out, crossing through the old administrative wing, that Primera sa doble. Italiano. The floor was a mess of soggy ceiling tiles and mud tracked in from a leak in the roof. Poking out from the muck was the corner of a plastic frame. I don't know why. I reached for it. Curiosity, I guess. I wiped away the worst of the sludge with my glove and saw it was a class composite photo. The gold lettering at the bottom, though faded, was still legible. Blackwood Academy, class of 1974. The faces were a blur of sepia and gray, hidden under a layer of dried silt. For some reason, I felt a desperate need to see them. I tucked the frame into my backpack and headed home, the feeling of being watched prickling the back of my neck the entire walk back to my car. When I got to my apartment, I set the photo on my kitchen table. The sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows across the room. I grabbed a damp cloth and some glass cleaner. Feeling like an amateur archaeologist, I started at the edges, wiping away the grime of 50 years. The teachers were in the top roster, and men in wide ties and women with stiff sprayed hair. Then came the students, row by row. Their faces emerged. They looked like any other kids from the 70s. Shaggy hair, bell-bottoms, and awkward, forced smiles. I reached the bottom right corner. I sprayed a bit more cleaner on the glass and rubbed in a circular motion. As the mud cleared, my hands stopped moving. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt like it stopped entirely. There, in the back row, stood a girl. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I thought maybe the light was hitting the glass wrong. I leaned in closer, my nose almost touching the frame. Tegorelian T 1974 photo wasn't wearing a polyester vest or a denim jacket like the others. She was wearing a technical hiking shell, a mustard yellow North Face jacket. I felt a surge of cold nausea. My eyes darted to the left elbow of the girl in the photo. There was a small, black, rectangular repair patch, frayed slightly at the corner. The exact same patch I had sewn onto my own jacket 3 weeks ago. I stumbled back from the table, my chair screeching against the hardwood. "It's a prank," I whispered to the empty room. "It has to be. Someone photoshopped this and left it there for me to find." But the frame was old. The wood was water-damaged and rot. The paper inside was yellowed and brittle, showing the unmistakable signs of decades of moisture. It wasn't a print. It was an original. I looked back at the photo, my vision tunneling. I realized I hadn't looked at the girl's face yet. I was too terrified of the jacket. I forced my gaze upward. The girl wasn't looking at the camera like the other students. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, looking at the person standing next to her. But as I stared at her features, the shape of the jaw, the curve of the nose, the room began to spin. It was my face. It was undeniably, perfectly me. But I wasn't smiling. In Teppo, my expression was one of pure, wide-eyed industrial-strength terror. My mouth was open as if I were screaming, though the grain of the old film made it look like a silent, hollow void. Then I noticed the hand. In the photo, a pale, elongated hand was reaching from the shadows behind the back row, its fingers digging into the shoulder of my mustard yellow jacket. The skin of the hand was gray and shriveled, like something that had been submerged in water for a long, long time. Suddenly, the power in my apartment flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, the only light came from the street lamp outside, filtering through my blinds. The stripes of light fell across the kitchen table, illuminating the photo one last time. I heard it then, a soft, wet sound coming from the hallway. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound of a heavy, rusted door being dragged across a floor, and then a smell filled the room. The unmistakable, suffocating scent of wet drywall, floor wax, and 50 years of rot. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the hallway. The hallway was empty, but when I swung the light back to the kitchen table, the photo was different. The girl in the yellow jacket, the girl who looked like me, was gone. The space in the back row was empty, leaving only the dark, blurred background of the school gym. I didn't stay to find out where she went. I ran out of that apartment with nothing but my keys and the clothes on my back. I'm staying at a hotel now, 3 towns over. But 10 minutes ago, I looked in the bathroom mirror to wash my face. I'm not wearing my yellow jacket anymore. I left it at the apartment. But when I looked in the glass, I saw a faint, muddy smudge on my shoulder. And when I tried to wipe it away, I realized it wasn't on the mirror. It was a bruise in the shape of a long, thin hand digging into my skin. They say that schools are built to hold the future, but in the ones left to rot, something else moves in to fill the silence. I went into that building looking for the perfect shot, but I left with the terrifying realization that someone or something had been waiting 30 years for me to arrive. I'm a freelance photographer, specializing in urban decay. There's a specific market for photos of peeling wallpaper, rusted swing sets, and the skeletal remains of places once filled with life. That's what brought me to the St. Jude's Elementary Annex. It was a small, parochial school tucked away in a wooded valley that had been shuttered overnight in 1994 due to a massive black mold infestation. The local legends were typical. Hauntings, cults, the usual stuff-bored teenagers makeup. I didn't care about that. I just wanted the aesthetic of the 90s frozen in time. I arrived around 4 p.m., hoping to catch the golden hour light as it filtered through the grime-streaked windows. The air inside the annex was freezing, much colder than the autumn afternoon outside. Every breath I took felt heavy, like I was inhaling the dust of 1,000 dead memories. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the rhythmic crunch-crunch of my boots on shattered fluorescent tubes. I spent an hour in the classrooms, capturing shots of chalkboards, still covered in long division problems, and cubbies still labeled with the names of children who were now well into their 40s. Around 5:30, I made my way down to the basement level, toward the boys' locker room. The smell changed as I descended. The musty scent of mold was replaced by something sharp and metallic. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating a row of narrow, teal-colored lockers. Most were hanging off their hinges, their interiors choked with spider webs and debris. That's when I heard it. Thump. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. I lowered my camera, listening. Thump thump. V V V V V V V V V V V. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical vibration. I followed the noise to the far end of the locker block. One specific locker number 214 was shaking. It wasn't the building settling. It was violent, rhythmic, as if something inside was trying to vibrate its way through the metal. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded thin and pathetic in the cavernous room. The vibrations stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, my flashlight trained on the rusted latch of locker 214. Part of me the sane part told me to turn around and run, but the curiosity that drives every photographer took over. I needed to know what was in there. I reached out, my fingers trembling. The metal was ice cold, but as I got closer, I felt a strange heat radiating from the gaps in the locker door. I grabbed the handle and yanked. It was stuck. I braced my foot against the frame and pulled with everything I had. With a deafening screech of protesting metal, the locker flew open. I stumbled back, expecting a raccoon or a burst of steam. Instead, I saw a lunchbox. It was a plastic Jurassic Park lunchbox, the kind that was everywhere in the early 90s. It looked brand new, not a scratch, not a speck of dust. But what stopped my breath was the heat. A visible mist of steam was rising from the edges of the lid. It looked like it had just been taken out of a microwave. Resting on top of the lunchbox was a yellowed piece of notebook paper. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my camera as I reached for the note. The handwriting wasn't messy. Blue ink, the kind of shaky print you'd expect from a second grader. It read, "I'm glad you finally made it, Mark. I made sure it stayed warm for you." The blood drained from my face. My name is Mark. I don't use my real name on my photography portfolio. I don't have family in this town. No one knew I was coming here today. I hadn't even told my roommate which school I was scouting. I dropped the note and used the end of my tripod to flip the lid of the lunchbox open. Inside was a sandwich, neatly cut into triangles with the crusts removed. The steam rolled out in a thick cloud, smelling of fresh bread and peanut butter. Next to it was an apple, polished to a high shine, and a small juice box. The juice box straw had been poked through the foil. A single, wet drop was still clinging to the end of the plastic. A sudden, wet, sliding sound came from the darkness of the shower stalls behind me. Slop, slop, slop. It sounded like bare feet, walking on wet concrete. I didn't look back. I grabbed my camera bag and sprinted. I flew up the basement stairs, my lungs burning from the moldy air. As I scrambled through the gym and toward the exit, I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper, and it wasn't a scream. It was a high-pitched, distorted recording of a school bell, echoing through the intercom system that shouldn't have had any power. Underneath the ringing of the bell, I heard a child's laughter hollow, echoing, and coming from the speakers directly above my head. I burst through the side door and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I locked the doors and sat there, gasping for air, waiting for my heart to slow down. I reached into my pocket for my keys. but my hand brushed against something crisp. I pulled it out. It was the note from the locker. I specifically remembered dropping it on the floor of the basement, yet here it was in my pocket. I turned it over. There was new writing on the back, the ink still wet enough to smudge. "Don't forget your bag, Mark. You left it in the locker room." I looked at the passenger seat. My camera bag was there. I looked back at the note, then I looked at the bag again. I slowly unzipped the main compartment of my bag. My camera was gone. A single hafitan sandwiched triangulin in a 1994 class photo of a young boy sitting in front of locker 214. The boy in the photo was holding my camera, and he was looking directly at the lens, waving. Thanks for watching. If you've ever had a creepy experience in an abandoned place, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe for more stories like these. And remember, some doors are closed for a reason. Stay safe.